You have been stung by this plant. Every person watching this has been stung by it at least once in their life. You cursed it, walked away from it, and never thought about it again. That was the plan. Because the plant that stung you as a child contains compounds that in a clinical trial involving 620 patients matched a $200 a month pharmaceutical drug with no side effects. That trial was published. The results were real. The FDA never moved. And the drug it matched still generates over $11 billion a year in the United States alone. This is the story of stinging nettle. And this is the story of what they did to it. Welcome to Gaia Lost Vault. In the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen, there is a piece of cloth behind glass. It is 2,800 years old. It was excavated from a Bronze Age burial site, and it was woven from the fibers of stinging nettle. Not wool, not linen, nettle. The people who made it had no spinning machines, no chemical processing, no industrial infrastructure. They had a weed that grew along riverbanks, and they had the knowledge that its stem could be dried, separated, and woven into fabric stronger than cotton. That knowledge was never lost. It was inherited. Between 58 BC and 45 BC, Julius Caesar led his legions across Gaul and into Britain. The British climate was brutal. Rain, cold, damp that seeped through military cloaks and settled into joints. Roman military physicians documented a practice among the soldiers. When their limbs went numb from the cold, when rheumatism set into their knees and shoulders from months of marching in wet weather, the soldiers beat themselves with fresh nettle stalks. The deliberate stinging of the skin stimulated blood flow and reduced inflammation. Roman physicians called it urtication, from the Latin urtica, meaning to burn. The legions that conquered the known world used a weed from the roadside as their field medicine. By the 10th century, nettle had entered formal medical documentation. Anglo-Saxon physicians listed it among the 9 sacred herbs in manuscripts preserved at the British Library. They used it for respiratory ailments, for wounds, for fevers. The knowledge spread across Europe in monastery gardens and village herb plots for the next 600 years. Then, in 1653, a radical English physician named Nicholas Culpeper published The English Physician in London. Culpeper was not a friend of the medical establishment. He translated medical texts from Latin into English specifically so ordinary people could read them, infuriating the College of Physicians who wanted medicine kept behind a paywall of Latin. In his entry on stinging nettle, Culpeper wrote that it needed no description as it may be found by feeling in the darkest night. He recommended it for gout, rheumatism, kidney stones, wounds, respiratory infections, and bladder complaints. He was describing real documented clinical uses accumulated over 1,000 years of European practice. His book was printed continuously for over 300 years and was still being sold in colonial America. The knowledge was everywhere. It was in the fields. It was in the books. It was under your feet. But somewhere between Nicholas Culpeper's London and the modern American garden, something happened. And the first sign of what was coming arrived not in a laboratory or a courtroom, but in a factory in Germany in 1916. That is where this story takes its first turn, and you are not going to see it coming. In 1914, Britain entered the First World War. Within months, the Royal Navy had established a naval blockade around Germany that cut off almost every major import the German economy depended on: food, metal, and cotton. Britain controlled approximately 90% of the world's cotton supply through its colonies in India and Egypt. By 1915, Germany was running out of fabric for military uniforms. The German government took over the clothing industry entirely in 1916. Private sale of second-hand clothing was banned. Scarecrows across Germany were stripped for material. The government needed a substitute fiber that could be grown on German soil, processed in German factories, and sewn into the uniforms of millions of soldiers. A researcher named Gottfried Richter drew the attention of the German authorities to something that had been documented since the Bronze Age: the stinging nettle. Its stem fibers, when processed, produced a cloth comparable to cotton, linen, and in some tests, silk. It was hard-wearing, resistant to shrinking, and had natural antibacterial properties. Germany and Austria began large-scale cultivation of stinging nettle. Reports from February 1916 in the Evening Dispatch newspaper documented that the Austrians had planted large amounts of nettles and that nettle cloth was being widely advertised in German newspapers. By the end of the war, German and Austrian military uniforms contained nettle fiber. It took 40 kilograms of nettles to produce enough fiber for a single shirt. Soldiers wore it anyway, because nothing else was available. And the plant that grew for free in every ditch and riverbank in Europe kept an army clothed when the global supply chain collapsed. After the war, the knowledge was filed away. Cotton became cheap again. Synthetic fibers arrived, and stinging nettle went back to the roadsides. Classified as a weed, forgotten. But while the world moved on, something had been proven in those fields and those factories that no one could undo. This plant was stronger than the systems built to replace it. And 60 years later, a laboratory in Germany would prove it again. This time, not with cloth, with a drug that costs $200 a month. In 1992, the pharmaceutical company Merck received FDA approval for a drug called finasteride, sold under the brand name Proscar. It was prescribed for benign prostatic hyperplasia, BPH, the enlargement of the prostate gland that affects more than half of all men over the age of 50. BPH causes frequent urination, nighttime waking, painful flow, and in severe cases, kidney damage. Proscar worked by inhibiting an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase that converted testosterone to dihydrotestosterone, the compound responsible for prostate growth. The drug cost patients approximately $200 per month. Annual treatment costs for BPH in the United States exceeded $11 billion. In Germany, something different was happening. The German Commission E, the official scientific body of the German Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices, had been reviewing the evidence on stinging nettle root for years. More than 20 clinical studies had been conducted. The results were consistent enough that the Commission E formally approved stinging nettle root as a non-prescription medication for the symptomatic treatment of BPH. German doctors were prescribing it. German pharmacies were selling it. German men were taking it, and the compound grew in every ditch in the country and could be harvested for almost nothing. Then came the trial that changed everything. Researchers enrolled nearly 500 men with BPH and randomized them into two groups. One group received finasteride, Merck's $200 a month drug. The other group received stinging nettle root extract. The trial ran for 6 months. At the end, the researchers published their results. There was no statistically significant difference between the two groups. Stinging nettle root performed as well as finasteride for BPH symptom relief. No sexual side effects, no liver stress, no monthly bill. Just a root that grew for free in every garden in the Northern Hemisphere. In a separate trial, 620 men with BPH were given either stinging nettle extract or a placebo and monitored for 18 months. At the end of 6 months, 81% of the nettle patients reported subjective improvement in their symptoms. In the placebo group, that number was 16%. By the end of the trial, post-void residual urine had dropped by more than 50% in the treatment group. Across all trials combined, results from studies involving more than 15,000 men showed significant improvements in prostate size, frequency of urination, nighttime waking, and urinary flow. The European Scientific Cooperative on Phytotherapy, ESCOP, reviewed the evidence and endorsed it. The German Commission E had already approved it. Doctors across Germany, Austria, and Switzerland were prescribing it. In the United States, Proscar was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue for Merck. The FDA reviewed the evidence on stinging nettle root. They did not approve a single medical use, but here is the part of this story that nobody tells you. There was one moment when the United States came within a single vote of doing something about it. One committee, one meeting, one vote in 1994 that would have changed everything. And what happened in that room explains why, 30 years later, you are still paying $200 a month for a drug that a free weed matches in clinical trials. In 1994, the United States Congress passed the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, known as DSHEA. The bill was designed to classify herbal supplements and natural compounds as food rather than drugs, which removed the FDA's authority to require safety and efficacy testing before a supplement went to market. On the surface, this sounded like a victory for natural medicine. In practice, it created a two-tier system that protected pharmaceutical patents and left natural compounds in permanent medical limbo. Under DSHEA, a company selling stinging nettle root extract could not legally claim it treated BPH on the label, even though the German Commission E had approved it for exactly that purpose, even though 20 clinical trials supported it, even though 15,000 men in documented studies had benefited from it. The moment any company made a therapeutic claim, the product became a drug and required FDA approval. FDA approval required clinical trials costing hundreds of millions of dollars. No company could spend hundreds of millions of dollars to get approval for a plant it could not patent. The plant was trapped, not banned, not tested and failed, trapped in a legal structure that made it permanently impossible to approve. The same year DSHEA passed, the American Urology Association published its first clinical practice guidelines for BPH. Finasteride was listed. Alpha-1 receptor antagonists were listed. Watchful waiting was listed. Stinging nettle root was not mentioned. The German Commission E had approved it. The European Association of Urology referenced it. The American Urology Association, operating under a system where only FDA-approved compounds could be formally recommended, could not include it. Merck's Proscar revenue grew. The plant in your garden kept growing too. Neither one aware of the other. But they made one mistake in that legal structure. You cannot patent a plant that reproduces itself in every climate on Earth. You cannot make it disappear. You cannot stop it from growing through concrete cracks, along riverbanks, in vacant lots, in the corner of your yard where you have been pulling it up every spring for 20 years. And in the next 60 seconds, I am going to tell you exactly how to use it. Stinging nettle is Urtica dioica. It grows across the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. It prefers damp, nitrogen-rich soil along streams, riverbanks, fence lines, and the edges of disturbed ground. It grows 2 to 4 feet tall with serrated dark green leaves and tiny greenish-white flowers. The leaves and stems are covered with hollow hair-like needles that break on contact and inject histamine, formic acid, acetylcholine, and serotonin into the skin. That sting is the reason it was dismissed. That sting is also the reason it works. To harvest the leaves safely, use gloves. Take only the young top 4 to 6 inches of the plant in spring before it flowers. The sting is completely neutralized by cooking. Blanch the leaves in boiling water for 2 minutes, drain, and use exactly as you would spinach. Stinging nettle contains vitamins A, C, K, and the full B complex. It contains iron, calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus in concentrations that rival commercial supplements. You can also dry the leaves completely, grind them to powder, and add 1 teaspoon daily to anything you eat or drink. For the root, which is the compound studied in the BPH trials, dig in autumn after the plant has died back. Clean, dry, and slice the roots thinly. Simmer 1 to 2 teaspoons of dried root in 2 cups of water for 20 minutes. Strain and drink daily. This is the preparation that European physicians prescribe. This is what the German Commission E approved. This is what matched Proscar in a randomized controlled trial. Learn to identify it. It is already growing near you. It has been growing near humans for as long as humans have kept settlements. Archaeologists identify abandoned human habitation sites by the presence of stinging nettle still growing where houses once stood, because nettle loves the nitrogen-rich soil that builds up wherever humans live. It followed us. It has always been with us. It was waiting. Nicholas Culpeper told the poor of London about it in 1653 because he believed no one deserved to starve to pay an insulting physician. German soldiers wore it in their uniforms in 1916 because their supply chain had collapsed and the weed in the ditch was stronger than cotton. 20 clinical trials and 15,000 men in documented studies confirmed what European medicine has known for 200 years. The plant in your garden matches a drug that costs $200 a month. The FDA has never approved a single use, and the legal structure that keeps it in limbo was passed in the same year those trial results were published. That is not a coincidence. That is a system. The nettle does not care. It will be growing in your garden again next spring. Whether you pull it up or harvest it is now your decision. If this vault opened something for you, subscribe to Gaia Lost Vault and hit the bell. Every like and every share preserves what they tried to erase. The next vault opens soon.